Alright, guys. Well, Fascism and Fighting Ghosts. The title does sort of allude to, Stuart's face, does allude to the fact that this probably is a home fixture for the CPGB, majority position in that sense, following the away leg at the Permanent Revolution School. And the idea of fascism and fighting ghosts, in some senses of chasing round the BNP as some sort of diversion from the main fundamental political tasks for the left today. This is the position I'll be speaking to broadly, and sort of explaining that and why I take that approach. The question of what is fascism. I think we have to be clear that there's no single ideology of fascism. It takes numerous forms, a mishmash, hodgepodge of ideas, although it can be based in its virulent anti-working class approach, its patriarchy and its nationalism. But essentially what it means, in my opinion, is essentially a counter-revolutionary force aside from the state, not related to the state, made into a battering ram to smash the organised working class movement as a whole. I think we have to be clear in that sense that there are differences in the nature of different fascist movements and organisations. The Italian fascisti are not the same thing as the German Nazis or the BUF, etc. And fascism plays a certain historical role where society essentially breaks down. The ruling class cannot rule in the old way, the conventional way that it did before, and where the working class is not in a situation to take power and change that order fundamentally. And what we see in that sense with fascism historically is a terroristic, bloody, violent form of Bonapartism. And I think it was Zetkin who said that fascism is essentially the punishment of the working class for not being able to take power in such conditions. Now, it's obvious today that in Britain, the British National Party, which comes from the sort of Hitler-worshipping tradition, has made certain gains within society, with 60-odd councillors now today, and a member on the London Assembly, and a certain name in politics. A party people often talk of, not just in the press or whatever, but actually in day-to-day society. So it's established certain roots. Now I think we have to be clear that we are not in a situation, in spite of that, where there is the possibility, precisely because of the objective circumstances, precisely because of what the BNP threat poses, the threat it poses, and the programme it organises on, we're not in a situation of the emergence of a mass fascist movement today, which is fundamentally clamping down on the working class's space to organise politically and organisationally. Now, I think the question of whether the BNP is fascist actually does reflect some wider questions about the rather strange political period we find ourselves in and the changing nature of certain organisations. Is the SWP still a Marxist, revolutionary Marxist or Trotskyist organisation? Is the Labour Party still some form of workers' party? I think it's an odd political period where things are quite in flux. Now, it's obvious that many of the leading cadre of the BNP, as I've mentioned, are of the hardcore Hitlerite background, and often are quite schooled in what I would classify as the old strategy of actually terrorising the left, breaking up meetings, particularly on the question of Ireland, and also organising against certain communities or minority groups. It's also clear to me that there is some sort of link, albeit maybe one of a sort of wink-wink, nudge-nudge relationship between the BNP and some of the isolated or individual acts of violence that we've seen against certain elements of the workers' movement. The guy from Merseyside Trades Council recently, and also the AWL comrade in Huddersfield, I think it was, wasn't it? I think it's obvious that there's some sort of relationship there. But what is equally clear is that we're not in a period of the 70s and the 80s. We're not in a situation where it is the political strategy of the BNP, in order to advance its cause and to gain roots in society, to go after the left. that's fairly obvious. We had, I think there's a joke mentioned at the Permanent Revolution Weekend School where Mark Hoskington said, well, the whole of the left is meeting here in this room this weekend, more or less, except for the AWL, I think it was. And it would be quite easy in that sense for fascistic organisations to come and break up those meetings and cause a lot of hassle. But the point is, this is not happening. And I think that says something about the reality of the political shift we see within far-right organisations, and particularly the BNP, because it's actually been able to patiently build up support in an electoral and political sense and gain certain roots in society, and actually has been far more successful than the left. And in a situation today, after the window of opportunity that opened up potentially for the left in 1997, if we had responded in a serious political way, patiently building up the necessary political alternative, you would argue that the left should be in a position today which is rather similar to that which the BNP is in today. I think that's quite obvious. So the left has failed on that account. So I think instead of living in that sort of time warp of days past, we have to actually account for the political reality we face. Now, this is in no way, I mean, it's been accused, I've been accused in some articles, etc., that essentially means falling for the far right's sort of portrayal of itself as something new and something different. And I think it's useful in this respect to actually underline this point of an organisation in flux, to quote Nick Griffin, which was, I think Dan quoted it at the Permanent Revolution School. He's quite clear. He says, this is a life and death struggle for white survival, not a fancy dress party. A little less banner waving, a little more guile wouldn't go amiss. As long as arcaders understand the full implications of our struggle, there is no need for us to do anything to give the public cause for concern. We must at all times present them with an image of moderate reasonableness. Of course, we must teach the truth to the hardcore, for like you, I do not intend this movement to lose its way, but when it comes to influencing the public, forget about genetic differences, historical revisionism or Zionism, Holocaust denial, and so on. All that people want to know is what we can do for them that the other parties can't or won't. Now, so it's quite clear in that sense that this is some sort of strategy for long-term building around the BNP. And reading those words, it's hard not to think in that sense of, in an opposite type of way, of the left. And actually, reading those words, it's sort of that you can think of John Rees at the foundation of respect, where he says, well, of course, we're into the old things like, Trotskyism, Marxism, working class socialism, etc. But at the moment, comrades, what we must do is go out and fundamentally, we voted against immigration, against the abolition of immigration controls, etc., etc. But we did that because we did it for those out there who matter. And I think that's quite important and significant in understanding the dynamics, not only of the right in that sense, but also of the left. And the problem that John Rees quickly encountered with people defecting to the Labour Party and also to the Tories in certain cases, is that there is, precisely with that approach, there is an underlying tension between, I suppose, what you could call theory and practice, and at some point that has to be bridged and has to be overcome. So I'm not saying for 1 minute that things can change very, very rapidly, and potentially with this so-called quote-unquote Tory revival that's happened in the 1970s, the BNP could lose a lot of its electoral support overnight, quite frankly. That could lead to a fundamental shift in their political strategy, and they could revert to it precisely by the means. No, this isn't a call to complacency or indifference or aloofness even in a political sense. But I think we also have to be clear in terms of characterising the BNP as a Nazi organisation, or as Griffin as a Nazi, that this is fundamentally misleading politically. And actually, if you want to combat something, you have to first fully understand it and grasp its dynamics. Because I think it's patently absurd that a fascistic movement in Britain, fascist movement taking root in society, would come in the banner, in German colours, in the banner of Nazism, in the language of Hitlerism. Because it's precisely, and this is a related point to popular frontism, which I'll come back to later on, but it's a lot of the left in calling the BNP Nazi, actually unconsciously or otherwise, reflects this sort of idea, which is a cornerstone of British nationalism, quite frankly, that the idea that of Britain's finest hour, we bash the Krauts, Churchill, etc., etc. And it was an interesting article in the Guardian where they were saying, well, that some Tory was moaning about how the BNP are trying to claim the mantle of Churchill. And the Tories went, no, they've got nothing to do with that, etc., etc. So I think this is a point which we have to be clear about. Calling something Nazi, in that sense, it can be politically misleading. And as I'll come on to, does lead to certain, what I think, flawed political perspectives when it comes to something like no platform and its very narrow application by the left and particularly within the framework of Unite Against Fascism. So what is to be done in that sense? I think there are two or three key principles which must inform the left's practice today in terms of learning the lessons of how to combat the BNP, but actually learning positively from the experience of the BNP in the sense of how to slowly build a political alternative and rise to the challenge of politics which is being thrown down. It's obvious that our tactical approach and the way we respond to certain questions flows from key principles and the question of programme. And the first thing to be said that nothing can be automatically ruled in or out. Marxism's strength lies precisely in its ability to concretely analyse situations and respond accordingly, and nothing is ruled in or out, as in the case of social democracy or anarchism. We might go for Stuart's proverbial baseball bats, two baseball bats, but it's also of equal legitimacy in that sense to actually go onto a lectural hustings platform, on a television debate, etc., etc. It might not be. It depends on concrete judgment. A fundamental principle as well is working class self-defence, including preemptive self-defence. So if it is the case that our comrades are being threatened or their space for organisation is being undermined, they're being physically attacked, the working class must organise self-defence. We don't just say, well, because at the moment maybe the threat from the right is not as great as it was or could be, we sort of shun that principle precisely because it is a principle, and we must raise those demands, including, as I'll come on to, a programme for the workers' militia as a broader aspect of our political programme in the here and now. The working class needs to organise a political alternative which is independent both of the bourgeoisie and its state. And this is where I come back to the question of the BNP as a Nazi party and popular frontism. Obviously, we have to reject calls of some of the left to turn the BNP into HMP and call for its banning, etc., because no one would argue on this platform for that, because as we've seen historically, those sort of measures, which were initially fought for to purportedly take on the right, we use against the left, etc. But we also have to free ourselves of politically tailing the democratic, normal, or legitimate political parties. Okay, because I haven't got the pamphlet on me now, but Chris Banbury writes a pamphlet where he says there's a difference between the normal party, the normal parties, and what I think he calls the established political order. Right? The established political order and the Nazis. Okay. Now I think that's a very, very dangerous path to go on, precisely because it does tail bourgeois politics, and it does allow for the silencing of a genuine working class political alternative. And that, in that sense, we come on to the question of no platform. Now let's be clear: no platform is a legitimate tactic and a string to our bow as a broader part of our strategy. Comrades have mentioned it before. I think it would be very legitimate, possibly legitimate in certain in current circumstances, to no platform Sean McGann talking about the anti-war movement. for example, and claiming the mantle of being the anti-war movement.
I'm trying to fix it with the beat.
It's something you wouldn't regret. Or Robert Griffiths talking in the name of communists in Britain, etc., etc. It's something that can be ruled out all the time. But it's not a political elixir, and it's definitely not something which I think Bill Jeffries referred to in some of the articles he wrote in response to mine. It's not something that you prioritise over something else. So Bill said, I think it was in Manchester at the Communist Students' Conference, he said, well, look, it's a bit like a strike, no platform. You organise your workers in the union, and if you can get a strike, you go for it. But if you can't, you have to go for something else. And he says, well, it's a bit like that with no platform. If you can no platform them and stop them speaking, that's good. But if you can't, you're going to have to think of something else. Right? I think that's precisely the wrong method of prioritising one over the other, not seeing it as a broad combination of both. And what it does actually play into is this illusion that you can kill fascism in the egg. Containment is the way to stop the far right, to stop the fascists. And I've used the example before of the arcade machine thing, where you bash the moles when they appear there. They raise themselves up, and you have to keep knocking. They keep coming up. And I'm not saying that's how you. It's not necessarily you bash them, but trying to prevent the far right organising and speaking at every possible opportunity does not work. And it also. It's proved by the fact that the BNP are here today. Look at their votes; they haven't gone away, despite the efforts before. So I think we have to be clear on that. Just again on this question of legitimacy, because it does relate precisely into the BNP are not legitimate, so we stop them speaking. But no, of course we could go we could debate a Tory, etc., or a Labour government minister, etc., etc. We could do that, but the BNP are not legitimate. Well, quite frankly, it's not for us on the left to declare what's legitimate or not, in terms of particularly given the organisational power and muscle we have at the moment. The fact is, the BNP have won themselves a platform, and they are using that platform to speak to thousands of working class people in Britain. We have to respond to that. With our own politics and in a political manner. I've got 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'll sort of wind it up a little bit. But just in terms of the conclusions, tomorrow there'll be this demonstration against the Red, White and Blue Festival, which is in Nottingham? Yeah, in Derbyshire. Now that's an action which should be supported. That's an action to be welcomed. But the point is, what do we do then from that? And I think that precisely this no platform issue, it's not that it isn't real. It's not that the BNP is not increasing its support and gaining support, but it's almost like the SWP leadership has sort of turned around and said, well, okay, the whole respect electoral thing didn't quite work out. What are we going to make the main thing now? And without completely untheorised, completely unthinking, this is how they're going to keep people active, by just chasing around the BNP where it raises its head, and not having any clear political strategy. In that sense, it's why I would see it as fighting ghosts. It's actually a diversion which is preventing the left from thinking about politics and the politics that are necessary to offer some genuine alternative, which is slowly and patiently built today in the working class movement. Trotsky once used the metaphor of the pistol and poison. All right, in terms of the threat of social democracy and fascism. I think we have to be clear what the main enemy is today, and the programme we need to articulate that. The main enemy is the British state. And that is the apparatus that's dividing our class, that's actually the main threat in communities, and fundamentally reactionary project, which is stopping the working class movement going forward. And I think this is precisely the point I'd like to conclude on. It's politically disarming to draw crude, mechanistic analogies to 1930s Germany, and also it's politically disarming to think that we can stop the Nazi BNP by just chasing them around. What the left needs to do, and in that sense take a leaf out of the BNP's book in that sense, is learn to patiently build a political alternative now. And that has to be principled. It can't be the sort of John Rees approach in terms of, we believe this, but when we go out to the masses of people, we give them something else. We need a programme which crucially takes up this question of the state as the main enemy, a programme for the Republic, for the militia, for the abolition of MI5, MI6, etc., democratic demands that take up these questions seriously and can actually gain a hearing in the working class movement. In that sense, and just to conclude, it's one of the tragedies of one of the failures of the left in that sense to do this has let the right pose as some sort of genuine alternative for working class people, and that's concretised in the question of immigration, because immigration is one of the questions today for which is raised in working class communities, quite rightly. And what is our response to it? The left's response has been, well, of course we believe in the abolition of immigration controls, but hey, we can't go out to normal people with that. Precisely, this is the wrong approach. We need to be patient and organise and argue within the working class movement for the politics which are necessary for our class to become politically hegemonic again. It's a slow, patient process, but just simply running around, as I say, bashing the moles at the arcade is not going to do that. It's part of our overall strategy, but we fundamentally need to rethink the political programme of our class today and take the necessary steps forward.
There are three questions around which this debate on fascism has revolved within the CPGB. What is fascism? Are the BNP fascist? And what is the usefulness of the no-platform tactic? On the first question, I'm broadly in agreement with the definition that Ben has put forward, that John Bridge has written about in the Rethinking Europe book, and that has informed the motion that the CPGB's majority has adopted. So I think that within the course of this debate and in the motion, it's become rather lopsided, and that the majority have basically bent the stick too far on the issue of fighting formations. The motion states that, quote, fascism launches physical force primarily against the organised working class. Fascist groups, movements and parties form counter-revolutionary fighting squads separate from the state. This is the essential characteristic of fascism that distinguishes it from other forms of counter-revolution. Put another way, fascism is a terroristic variant of Bonapartism. In a certain formal sense, this is true, but it leaves questions unanswered on the idea of fascism as a terroristic variant of Bonapartism. If we think about this more deeply, Bonaparte's own Bonapartism was terroristic. There are other variants of Bonapartism as well, which are non-fascist but also terroristic. So I don't think that there is enough. The motion also lumps together fascist groups, fascist movements and fascist parties, and makes no mention of fascist individuals, and makes no distinction between how these operate in different situations and different periods. The motion tells us that fascist groups grow in periods of crisis, but it doesn't tell us whether we can expect their tactics to change depending on the period and this sort of thing. And finally, and very importantly, the definition does not say whether fascist groups form and maintain fighting formations at all times. The motion basically encourages members to assume that they do, which I think is wrong. I'd say that central to the definition of fascism is the fact that it seeks to build a mass movement to impose its policies by direct action and force, and it seeks to use its own force and not rely on that of the state. Therefore, it's certainly central to a fascist strategy to form fighting squads. And contrary to what some CPGBers have said in debate, this is still clearly part of the BNP's aim in the medium term, part of its strategy. And this is shown in the quote that Ben has used from Griffin, and in other areas. And also, as nobody denies, it's a central part of their past. Much has been made by CPGB majority comrades of the fact that the BNP do not currently operate fighting squads, but they have done little or nothing to seriously explain the unofficial or nudge-nudge, wink-wink violence which emanates from the BNP and their supporters. It's positive development, and this hasn't always been the case, that Ben has recognised that there is some link between this now. And in relation to the title of this session, surely it should be clear that these actions, such as the attacks that Ben has mentioned, also, I mean, they're part of a long list of these incidents. Okay, they're not on a mass scale, but they're not so infrequent that they shouldn't concern us. And Comrade Bob has also told us about the Respect meeting in Swansea, which had to change its venue after threats of violence. These are not the actions and the threats of ghosts. And aside from these direct attacks on members of the left, we also need to think about the other attacks that take place against minorities, immigrants and other oppressed sections within society, which can also be linked to the activity of the BNP. The issue of how to counter this violence, I don't think has been properly addressed by the majority either. By lumping together fascist groups and fascist movements and encouraging an assumption that fighting squads are a permanent feature, the motion passed by the majority posits a very straightforward conclusion, that the BNP are no longer fascist because they do not organise fighting squads. As accepted by some, probably most, that there is a fascist core at the centre of the BNP. Comrades and Ben's done so again today, have suggested that their theory will somehow likely follow their practice, and they will eventually end up dropping these ideas. Though Ben has said, and I haven't heard him say it before today, that it is possible that the BNP can revert to this a more overt form of violence and seeking to contest for the streets. It's not the case that their theory is always going to follow their practice. These things can operate both ways, depending on what happens in politics and the class struggle. And certainly the BNP leadership and the fascist core within them see things as developing in this way. And documentary entitled Young, Nazi and Proud, Mark Collett, a former BNP youth organiser, was caught on camera saying that they were basically waiting for anti-immigrant race riots, things that he saw similar to Bradford, Oldham and Burnley, but on a larger scale, to break out so that they could launch a civil war on chauvinist lines. It was also part of their politics that they expect an economic crisis, and following from their theory of peak oil, an ecological crisis which would lead to wider social ferment and allow them to seek to contest for the streets and step up that area of their work and change tactics in that way. The turn towards elections and attempts at respectability, which is real and must be taken into account, also must be seen in this light. The changes in their tactics and the opportunities available to them are linked with changes in the material circumstances and developments in wider politics. At present, there is no objective basis for a mass fascist movement. We are not in the midst of a general economic crisis, and the left is pitifully weak and disorganised. There's no real reason for them to come along and smash up meetings at Ulu or Conway Hall when the left is so insignificant as it is at the moment in society. But this doesn't negate the other acts of violence that emanate from them in their periphery and the threat that they can potentially pose in the future. In this period, they're attempting to build a wider base of support, but not without success through electioneering. I think that members of the party majority, if they're going to say that the BNP are no longer fascist, they need to go beyond this and actually explain what the BNP is, because in the motion drafted by John, they're lumped together with UKIP and right populist organisations, which I don't think is helpful in the least. I think as Ben has said, there's potential for them to flip back into overt fascist politics. So what are they at the moment? I think that's a question that needs to be addressed. Also, the question of what are the main problems for the working class movement with the BNP at the present. I'd say that they spread divisions within the working class, they pose as an anti-establishment force and are thus some sort of competitor on some level with the left for those disillusioned with mainstream politics. Their own members, supporters and periphery engage in small-scale acts of violence and threats against leftists. Where they have influence and success, this is followed by increases in racist and anti-immigrant violence, etc. And they have the potential to play a key part in the formation of a more dangerous fascist movement in the future. So how should the left respond? First off, it must be said that no group on the left gets this right. The response from most of the left, primarily the SWP through the Anti-Nazi League and Unite Against Fascism, also smaller groups such as the Socialist Party, their attempts a few years back to build a front, Youth Against Racism in Europe, and other groups seek to attempt to build some kind of people's front against fascism or Nazism in the case of the SWP. I agree with Ben that this isn't a helpful definition in any way. It's a much more specifically German variant of fascism. And this basically popular frontist approach, which apes Dimitrev's line and seeks to build anti-fascist unity with all non-fascists in society, leads them to cuddling up with all sorts of right-wing politicians, such as Tories, such as Teddy Taylor, and all sorts of right-wing politicians who espouse chauvinist ideas, which in some way lead into the ability of the BNP to win wider support, all wrapped up in these popular fronts that left groups such as the SWP try to organise. And politically, this draws on all sorts of chauvinist nonsense in British culture connected with World War II. In respect, we saw Galloway openly identifying World War II as Britain's finest hour. And the supposed revolutionaries in the SWP are happy for people to spout this crap as long as they endorse their fronts such as UAF, through which the SWP hope to recruit. The SWP can also come out with this stuff themselves. They insist that the BNP, almost uniquely, are not a respectable or legitimate political party. Presumably, I think the imperialist Tory and Labour parties are respectable and legitimate. The SWP have also played up the role of the Allies in World War II in socialist worker recently. Comrade David Broder, who spoke here last night, has taken them to task for this on his blog. I'll just read a short quote from there. He says, Simon Asaf tells us that over 10,000 West Indians volunteered to defend Britain against the Nazis, neglecting to mention the imperialist character of the war on both sides. He makes no reference whatsoever to colonial exploitation in the British Empire, and in this vein uses the word flowed rather oddly in the sentence, many people in the British Empire took part in raising money to help the war effort, in addition to the extra taxes, raw materials and food that flowed from the colonies to support the war. Surely he means were forcibly taken. Alongside all this popular frontism, the SWP still clings to the dogma of no platform as an absolute principle. They very rarely attempt to impose this through mass direct action. The Oxford Union incident is counter to this trend. Instead, they look to the state and other bureaucratic forces to ban the BNP from this or that event, or celebrate the potential locking up of Nick Griffin, turning BNP into HMP, and saying all sorts of ridiculous illusions in the British state. On the other hand, there are a number of smaller Trotskyist groups who rightly oppose the popular frontism of the SWP and UAF, and generally oppose state bans, but also make a dogma out of no platform. No platform, as I see it, is a tactic, and it is one that I believe in certain instances is suited to this period. It is not something we save to pull out of the bag when there are mass fascist movements. No platform is only a part of our fight against the BNP and its influence, but it is an important and useful one that we must not give up. We must see it as part of a strategy of working class and oppressed community self-defence against the admittedly limited in this period dangers that I outlined the BNP as posing earlier. This does not mean that we should make a principle out of the no platform tactic. We must be flexible. On this, the majority is formally correct to say that we consider the tactic of no platforming opponents perfectly legitimate, as it does in the majority's motion. The problem with this is the majority refuse to outline some general situations in which they think no platforming might be appropriate. The only instances that Ben can come up with today is no platforming the leaders of the AWL or the CPB. I agree that we need to assess these situations concretely, but we can at least come up with some hypothetical or historical situations in order to make things clearer. I read yesterday the transcripts of the debate that Mike and Dan from PR had at the PR school, and Mike is much more concrete, I think, than anyone else in the CPGB majority, and basically states that no platforming should be dropped completely in this period. I think basically because there is no mass fascist movement at the moment, and that no platforming at the moment is a popular frontist diversion. I disagree. He does say that he supports other modes of self-defence, such as stewarding in the current period, but I still think that no platforming is a valid tactic for today. I think there are situations, I think debate can also be effective in certain situations. We have to assess the concrete situation and see what options are open to us and what is most likely to be effective. People often look at the Oxford Union incident and say that Wayman Bennett should have spoken in the debate and that the correct ideas of the left should have been able to defeat the nonsense of the BNP. This neglects to mention all of the assessment, which I think the party majority is correct in saying that the SWP and Wayman Bennett's politics themselves are absolutely fucked. I mean, it's not the correct ideas of the left debating the BNP in that situation. It's popular frontism, which is going to do us no good. So why encourage him to come out with this nonsense and only reinforce chauvinist ideas in its way? Absolutely. If we are asked to debate Nick Griffin ourselves, that might perhaps be a different matter. But the point of any debate would not be to change the ideas in Nick Griffin's head, but those of the audience and wider society. But most times the BNP meets, they do not invite the left to debate them. When they attempt to come onto our campuses and hold meetings, they want to put forward their own message and organise these meetings accordingly. Where this happens, I think communist students should be at the forefront of exposing their politics in a principled manner and attempting to disrupt the smooth running of their events. A principled working class opposition needs to be posed. I don't think this tactic should be exclusive to fascists either. In certain circumstances, I think it would be appropriate to no-platform a Tory along in the vein of Enoch Powell's appearance at your university. You could guarantee, in a particular situation, would stir up racial divisions and likely lead to an increase in attacks. Also, no-platforming government ministers in times of war, when the anti-war movement is strong, can be a useful form of protest. This debate is specifically about anti-fascism, but it must be said, and I agree with Ben here, that bourgeois parties are the main spreaders of chauvinist ideas, and their state are our main opponents. Attacking immigration controls, opposing nationalism, and attacks on democratic rights, etc., flow from this as important issues to take up. Also, throughout this, our priority must be the rebuilding of the workers' movement and the establishment of the Communist Party. But I don't think that, in this sense, the BNP and fascism and anti-fascism is a diversion. I don't think it's a diversion in reformulating a programme for the working class to come to power. I think it has to be seen as part of the formulation of that programme. That's why debates like this, I think, are important. Only with such a party can we win world revolution, the only means of banishing fascism for good. And in that I agree, and I don't think anyone actually on the left, and certainly not in this organisation, thinks that you can kill fascism in the egg. It can only be killed with capitalism.
Okay, David Esterson from Permanent Revolution. I'd like to thank you first of all for inviting me to speak. And actually I'm going to cover much of the ground that Dave certainly has covered, us, particularly over the questions, because I was trying to work out exactly where the differences really seem to lay within the organisation around the BNP and fascism. So the main points I want to try and cover is what is fascism, how not to fight fascism and how to defeat it. Is the BNP fascist? And the other key question I think we need to deal with is fascism an imminent threat? Okay, I'm going to read a definition that we originally developed about fascism when we were actually part of the Workers' Power Group. But I would still say that the main thrust of it is correct. What is fascism? Fascism is distinguished from other reactionary parties by the radically different manner by which it seeks to change the relationship between the classes in capitalist society in order to safeguard the rule of the bourgeoisie. It is a party of civil war against the working class, both in its methods and in its objectives. To achieve power, fascism, as distinct from other reactionary parties, sets out to terrorise and then physically smash the proletarian organisations by organised direct action. For this it requires an extra-parliamentary mass movement. Fascism is a party that has to be visible on the streets. It appeals primarily to the desperate layers of capitalist society, the petty bourgeoisie, caught between the major classes, jealous of the bourgeoisie and fearful of the working class, the lumpen proletariat, outside the organisations of the working class, and prey to every poisonous prejudice bourgeois society emits, and eager to blame its miserable lot on the nearest scapegoats to hand. Out of this social rabble, fascism builds its mass movement. And from this movement, it constructs the fighting squads it needs for its war on the workers' organisations. Normal bourgeois democratic parties leave a physical war against the left strictly to the state, not so for fascism. It does the job itself with its own militia. Likewise, with its racism, it does not restrict itself to calls for state racism, deportation and the removal of civil rights. It takes direct action to terrorise immigrant populations. Now I'm going to argue that although we haven't seen the mass Nazi party, the BNP is not like the mass Nazi party, but those are key parts of the plans and objectives of the British National Party. And I think there is, although there would be a lot of agreement on what I've just read out, I'm sure there'll be a lot of agreement. I think I read your resolutions, and in point 2 of your resolution, it doesn't mention the movement. It only mentions the fighting squads. And I think unless you look at the question of fascism building itself as a popular movement, a movement on the streets, a movement of direct action, then you don't really understand how it is different from most constitutional or bourgeois democratic parties, and uses that movement in order to recruit to its fighting squads. It can't build the fighting squads which then builds the movement. It has to build the movement, and it recruits directly out of that movement to build its fighting squads. I think that's an omission in I think it's both an omission in the majority and the minority resolutions on your definition of fascism. Right, how not to fight the BNP and fascism? Well, I agree. I don't think there'll be any disagreement. Popular frontism is definitely not the way to fight fascism. Basically, popular frontism, not just apply against fascism, but in other situations, is fundamentally about restricting the demands of the working class in order to allow ourselves to have bourgeois allies, something that we should not accept and something that is wrong, not just tactically but strategically. Legalism, hoping that somehow bourgeois democracy or the constitution will save us from fascism. The German Social Democrats thought that Hitler wouldn't dare go against the constitution, and the president would act against him as soon as he took any action which was against the Weimar Republic. That worked well, didn't it? So legalism is absolutely no use whatsoever. Reliance on the state. The whole question of state bans, we know that the state bans will always be used against the left. The Public Order Acts of the 30s, which were introduced supposedly to control Mosley, were of course first used against the left and predominantly used against the left and rarely used against Mosley. I mean, I have my own personal experience of this. My granddad was a Jewish young man in Southend, and he wasn't particularly political at the time, and he went to see a Mosleyite rally in Southend, and with his brother, he came home and he was crying, and my grandmother said, "What's the matter? What happened?" And he said, I couldn't believe it. The Mosleyites were marching and the police attacked the anti-fascists. And this was a complete wake-up call for him. The horses were used to charge the anti-fascists and to defend the Mosleyites and the black shirts. And I mean, it led him to teach me from an early age that all police are bastards, which I think is still true, and everything I've seen in my life just confirms that. But it's a real lesson that people who might have been involved in the struggle against the National Front will have also seen that the police, far from being a useful tool to stop fascists, will be used to defend them. Okay, at particular times, and I think now is a particular time, the state will want to clamp down on the activities of fascist organisations like the BNP, because in fact at the moment they don't really need them in any desperate sense, and in a certain sense the BNP can be a cause for instability. So how do we need to fight fascism? Again, I think there'll be a lot of agreements. I don't think no platform is the only thing, or that what we have to do with fascists is crush them in the egg, and then every time they come up again we send them back down to the sewers. No, we need to put forward our solutions on the questions of immigration, all the politics, all the nationalist and reactionary politics that the BNP is raising. We need to answer these points with socialist answers, with our solutions on the question of housing, on the question of unemployment. All of these things we've got socialist answers for. On the question of provision of services, we have answers to deal with the BNP's lies and so on. But I think there is something more. We do need to argue for a united front of the working class. That is unity in action against the fascists, against the BNP, including the use of no platform, and whenever necessary, organised self-defence, whether it be immigrant communities or left organisations. And I think that's quite an interesting point in terms of self-defence, because I'll go on to argue why I think, although they haven't got formally organised fighting squads, the BNP at the moment, and they haven't got a stormtrooper SA type organisation, they are certainly involved in small attempts to use violence and organised fighting forces. Same for us. I'm in favour of a workers' militia, but I don't go to my workplace and trade union branch and say, right, today we must form a workers' militia. Unlike the BNP, I'm open about my aims, but the difference is, at every opportunity in the class struggle, we would also seek to use those opportunities of self-defence, to build self-defence organisation, and use it as both a way to progress the organisation of self-defence for the working class and their political consciousness as well around the question of self-defence. But of course I ultimately agree that the only way to finally defeat fascism is we need to build a revolutionary movement. We need proletarian revolution and socialism. That is the only way to defeat fascism ultimately. Although I would say this analogy that Ben used of the mole keep popping up. Well, until we have the international world revolution, I'm afraid this is going to be the case with all struggles. This is going to be the question of our wages, on the question of our conditions at work, on the question of our rights. At all points, the bourgeoisie will keep coming back at us, and at all points we'll have to keep fighting them. So the fact that the fascists keep popping up again, well, I'm sorry, that's the nature of struggle. They will keep popping up again as long as we have capitalism, and we will keep having to bash them on the heads. And that is what we will have to do. So I think there's a danger in that whole understanding. And I think again in point 9 of the majority resolution, it really misses the point around this, because it says that using force alone will not stop the fascists forever. Only revolution will. That's true, but trade unions organising for better health and safety will not stop workers being maimed and killed at the workplace as long as there is production for profit. It will not stop it. Only a revolution will. But does that mean we don't fight it every day? Does that mean we don't engage in that struggle? Do we argue that, well, we can't actually finish this off until there's a revolution, therefore we don't participate in this day-to-day struggle? No, of course, as communists we absolutely get involved in the day-to-day struggle and argue at the same time that as long as there is a profit system, there will be maiming and killing of workers for profit on the basis of health and safety. So this idea that somehow the struggle against fascism can only be with the big event, when it's finally the showdown in the revolutionary crisis between the proletarian organisation or the fascist mass movement, I think is an error and something you need to reconsider. Is the BNP fascist? Well, let's look at the ideology and programme. Let's see if I've got a couple of things here. The BNP's mission statement. Not surprisingly, it doesn't mention fascism or dictatorship. It doesn't mention death camps. It doesn't mention bans on trade unions or other political parties. It doesn't call for a movement or street gangs to attack the immigrants of the left. Not in its mission statement at all. It's rather a bizarre mission statement. I hope you forgive me, I'm going to read some of it out to you. Because it's a rather bizarre sort of racial, nationalistic mission statement.
I think it's unprincipled to read it out.
I don't agree with that. The BNP exists to secure a future for the indigenous peoples of these islands in the North Atlantic, which have been our homeland for millennia. I hope you're becoming proud at this point. We use the term indigenous to describe the people whose ancestors were the earliest settlers here after the last great ice age. It goes on and on and on. But it gets even better. We are the torchbearers of culture. The rich legacy of tradition, legend, myth, and the very real wealth of landscape and man-made structures is one of the island's richest treasures. The men and women of the British National Party are motivated by love and admiration of the outpouring of culture, art, literature, and the passage of living through the ages that has left its mark on our very landscape. We enthuse with pride at the marvels of architecture and engineering that have been completed on these islands since the construction of the great megaliths 7,000 years ago. It is quite bizarre. So that's their mission statement. So I thought, I wonder how that compares with the Nazi Party's mission statement. Well, they didn't have mission statements in those days, they had programmes. And the National Socialist German Workers' Party had a 25-point programme. And surprisingly, the Nazis also have no mention of fascism or dictatorship in their programme. They don't mention death camps. They don't mention any bans on trade unions or other political parties. They don't mention the need for a movement or street gangs to attack immigrants on the left. It's not in their programme. It's not the whole point of their ideology is not written down in terms of they are going to attack the working class movement like this. In fact, some of their 25 points have got very populist and socialistic demands, such as abolition of unearned incomes, the breaking of rent slavery. Of course, we know they had to do this at the time because there was mass socialist and communist organisations, and they had to appeal to the socialist ideas that were going around at the time. So what we have here is, of course, the hidden aims of fascism. They don't openly declare they're going to build concentration camps and death camps and send us all off. But after the defeat of the Mussolini and Hitler regimes, the reality of what a fascist regime would mean changed the situation for the fascist organisations. It was openly seen the kind of barbarism that you could expect with a fascist party coming to power. And this led, along with the post-war boom, there was a democratic and anti-fascist consensus, and the fascists were left with the option: remain tiny sects, Nazi sects, or try to build larger organisations, including the use of front organisations if you need to. I won't go through the whole history of the BNP, but let's have a look at some of its key important points. The first thing, it was founded by John Tyndall. It's not a question of being abusive to call him a Nazi. He is a Hitlerite. You can go to many websites and see lovely pictures of him in Nazi uniforms, parading about in front of pictures of Adolf Hitler. He is a Hitlerite. It's not a question of you're a Nazi, you're a fascist. He absolutely is in favour of that. And it has been one of the foremost Nazis. He set up the BNP. The BNP helped set up Combat 18 as its security force. It may have distanced itself from them because it wants a certain respectability, a certain legitimacy, but they set them up as a security force. Again, after they won the Millwall council election, they distanced themselves from C18. But, for example, although the party banned dual membership, in September 1995, 4 of the 5 London BNP branch organisers attended a C18 meeting. They're absolutely still in contact with these kind of organisations. Go through the history of Griffin. He is a Nazi. Again, it's not an insult. He is a Hitlerite. That's what he believes in. He thinks that David Irving is soft on the Holocaust denial. He thinks that David Ehrling gives some credence to the fact there was any death camps or massacre of Jews and other populations in the Second World War. He bases his political ideas, he's gone through various flips and flops in his fascist ideology, but one of the key people he based his ideas on was somebody called Julius Evola, an Italian National Socialist. He was a friend of Robert Fiore, an Italian fascist who was almost certainly involved in the bombing of Bologna railway station. Of course, Bologna was being... give us a few more minutes. Because Bologna was, of course, a red Bologna, a communist town. They wanted to introduce terrorism into that area. Griffin joined the BNP in 1995. He edited The Rune, which is an anti-Semitic quarterly. He worked with Tyndall, and he's made a lot of very interesting statements. I know Ben's already quoted one. There's another one. He spoke to an international meeting, a private Nazi meeting in the US. Nick Griffin admitted that the party's newfound respectability was simply a tactic to con the British people. My politics have not changed, he told the audience of racists and Nazis. I still believe in fighting for this, he added, pointing to his white skin. That's Griffin. Mark Collett, people have seen the documentary, he's a Nazi. He was the leader of the young BNP. When he was exposed, he wasn't expelled from the party, he's been promoted. He said, National Socialism was the best solution for the German people in the 30s. I honestly can't understand how a man who's seen the inner city hell of Britain today can't look back on that era, it was Germany, with a certain nostalgia. There have been opposition to him being a full-timer and an officer of the BNP within the BNP, because he was obviously such an open Nazi. Opposition was crushed, and Griffin has completely stood beside Collett on this question. Tony Lacoma, who up until 2006 was a key development officer of the BNP. He's been convicted of explosive attempts. He tried to bomb the WRP offices at one point. He was, in 1991, he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for unlawful wounding for his part in an attack on a Jewish school teacher who he caught trying to peel off a BNP sticker. These people are thugs, they are Nazis. And this is the best one. I didn't even know this bloke existed. The BNP have got a magazine called Identity, and the editor is John Bean. This is how the Identity website on the BNP described him. John Bean is a veteran nationalist who has given over half a century to the movement. First involved in the original British National Party back in the 60s, John has made a massive contribution to nationalism and has always been part of the progressive movement, driving nationalism forward to electoral success. He's been involved in the BNP TV production about his life called John Bean, a True Nationalist. Now it's interesting because many people think when the BNP talk about nationalists, they're covering up for their racism. But for the BNP leaders, they're absolutely clear what their nationalist means. Their nationalist means fascist. So let's have a look at who this veteran nationalist is. John Bean joined Oswald Mosley's union movement in the 1950s. He taught John Tyndall electoral politics and played a leading role in a number of fascist organisations. In 1962, he was quoted in the Daily Mail describing himself as the Goebbels of Britain's Nazis. Goebbels of Britain's Nazis. This is the leadership. I could name a whole load of other local leaders who are similarly thuggish and fascists. Okay, but just because the BNP leadership is jam-packed with Nazis, does this make it a Nazi organisation? Well, I think it's a good pointer to the fact it's a Nazi organisation, what its aims are, what its objectives are. But what about the street movement, the fighting squads that are really at the core of the fascist movement? They want to build a movement. Okay? There is no imminent danger of a national mass fascist movement, even less chance of them taking power. The bourgeoisie do not need them to crush a revolutionary movement of the working class at the moment. That is not necessary for them. But they want and are trying to build a movement and are having some success in local areas. They are preparing for a mass movement and they are building some local bases. And the problem is, why should we let them prepare this movement? Let's stop them. You go on to have a look at the websites the blogs from their sympathisers, they're absolutely clear about what kind of movement they want to build. They don't want to build a constitutional electoral movement of whites voting for their rights. They want whites to go on the streets to terrorise and attack and intimidate as part of a movement on the streets. That's what they want. That is not what Griffin's writing. That's what a lot of their local sympathisers and activists are quite clear about. That's what they want. They want the whites to rise up against the fact that our rights are being denied, that immigrants are getting all the privileges. This is the kind of movement they want. There are links as well. They have a whole series of members that have been involved in terrorist activities, preparing for war, arms, explosives, etc., etc. They have links with people who have training squads. And this has a consequence. See, I think it's quite complacent, the title, Fighting with Ghosts. Because in certain local areas, it's not a question of fighting with ghosts. Okay? 1993 I mentioned, when they won the Tower Hamlets, the Millwall council election, there was a 300% increase in racial attacks in the area. That's not fighting with ghosts. Sorry, the local black and immigrant population were not fighting with ghosts. They were fighting with thugs, racist thugs who were being fundamentally organised by the BNP. The riots of 2001. We've got a report from the World Socialist website on Burnley. Those riots in Burnley occurred shortly after the BNP had been in the area whipping up a load of trouble before the election. Those groups of white youth who went down to attack and intimidate the Asian population, but were fought back against by the Asian youth, that was whipped up by the BNP. Would have been a much better position if the left and the trade union movement, along with the Asian youth and the local immigrant population, had been able to stop them whipping up that trouble beforehand, had been able to intervene beforehand and stop them putting out their poisonous lies and getting to the youth. And that would have meant a confrontation. It would have meant a physical action against the fascists. There would have been no other alternative. Because there are numerous examples of intimidation and attacks by the BNP. It's true, the BNP have not yet formed a stormtrooper type organisation, nor is it about to smash the working class movement or take power. That is the plan, though. That is exactly what they know what they're doing. And meanwhile they're organising, they're carrying out intimidation, they're building a movement in some areas, and they are hoping, and Griffin's very clear about this, they're hoping that when a crisis comes, they will be ready. And that's absolutely clear. But we cannot just look at the classical fascist parties and equate them with the BNP. And there are particular historical reasons for that. If we look at the Italian example, the fascists from their birth to taking power was a very short period of time. That's because there was a revolutionary crisis, and the ebbing of the revolutionary crisis was that the Italian working class failed to take power, and the bourgeoisie, lock, stock and barrel, decided they were going to fund, arm the fascist movement, which they did, and it grew and took power. Slightly different for the Nazi Party, although it's bigger, and obviously Germany throughout the 20s and early 30s was a situation of much greater crisis than Britain is today. It's not the case that at all times the German Nazi Party was engaged in attempts to smash the working class organisations. It was nowhere near big enough to do that for the first years of its life. Even after the 1923 revolutionary crisis, the Nazi Party only grew to 20,000 members. At the time, the Communist Party alone had 300,000 members, and I don't even know the figures for the Social Democratic Party. It probably ran into at least 1 million, if not more. They were not in a position to send their stormtroopers in to smash workers' meetings in Berlin. Couldn't have done it. Doesn't mean that wasn't their intention, it wasn't their goal, it was their goal. In fact, after Hitler was released from his imprisonment in the Beer Wall Putsch, the Nazi Party had been banned and the stormtroopers had been banned, and the revolutionary crisis was over. And Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party, but insisted, he did a BNP-like turn. He insisted at the time that the Nazi Party were not going to take power through force, and they would have to rebuild themselves in the immediate future in constitutional terms, and they wouldn't be a paramilitary organisation at the time. Of course, that was all covered up, and they rebuilt the stormtroopers, and they attacked where they could, and they intimidated where they could. They couldn't smash large workers' organisations or meetings or rallies, but what they did do is they had a plan of what they called collisions, small street fights, where they were in the majority in a town, or where they could intimidate people, they would attack the odd paper seller, they would attack the odd leftist, and so on. And if we look at the BNP, we can see, for their size, and knowing the situation they're in, with their whole tactic, their whole policy, they are already involved in this kind of thing. I've got a whole list of different intimidations. We've heard the latest examples in Huddersfield and so on. But there's a whole list. In the 2003 election, they were involved in intimidating anti-racist leafleters, threatening them, saying, if you give out your leaflets, we will bash you. Okay? They also, in Halifax, they mobilised a mob of 60 to 80 BNP supporters to stop leafleters. There's just a whole series of examples of this kind of intimidation and attacks that's been going on. And this is absolutely linked to where the BNP are organising and where they're having success at building grassroots organisations. And all these examples, they make me beg the questions to the comrades here. Can you tell me of a similar litany of attacks and intimidation that are carried out by far-right populist parties like the UKIP or the Conservative Party?
Conservative Party, years and years, yes. Not now, but in the 1930s, the Conservative Party had that.
Well, 1930s was different because there was an absolute blurring, and that's a whole different political question between what was going on with the Conservative Party and the bourgeoisie and supporting fascism and so on. But in terms of what's going on now, the UKIP don't involve themselves in this kind of intimidation. The Conservative Party don't do it. If you want to ask about are the BNP preparing for intimidation, violence and street gangs, they are doing it wherever they have the opportunity to. This is not, I think it's rather complacent to say that the BNP is not the main threat. I don't think it is the main threat. It's a bit of a truism to say the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois state is the main threat. That's always the case. In my workplace, the BNP is not the main threat. But if you were an Asian youth in Burnley in 2001, the BNP was certainly one of the main threats and had to be dealt with. So I'll finish up with Griffin's final words that he was reported as saying in the Rune, his own journal. The electors of Millwall did not back a postmodernist rightist party, but what they perceived to be a strong, disciplined organisation with the ability to back up its slogan, defend rights for whites, with well-directed boots and fists. When the crunch comes, power is the product of force and will, not a rational debate.
We meant to clap.
Well, in one sense, the fascist parties, social democracy, conservative constitutional parties, they're all the same. They're all about defending the bourgeois order. But if you believe they're all the same and there are no differences, and therefore no different tactics towards those parties, I will not ever join the CPGB, because it's the same position as the social fascist position in the early 30s in Germany. There is a difference. Yes, they're all going to defend the bourgeois order ultimately, but there is a difference between fascist parties and social democracy. And I'm not saying as well, and nobody said, and sure, certainly didn't say that the number one enemy was the BNP. Nobody said that at all. Let's be absolutely clear. And your resolution talks about the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois state being the main enemy. That's always true, in one sense. It's always true. There are particular times and particular attacks. In 1984, it was the main problem. The main problem was an attack on the working class movement around the miners' strike. Yeah? In 2001, in Burnley, what was the main problem? The main problem was the BNP, and then the state, which came down to clamp on the attempt at self-defence by the Asian youth and the Asian population. So, I wouldn't say that the BNP is the main problem or the main enemy or the thing we have to. No, that's all just demagogic rubbish that we've never said. But if you say they're not a problem, there's a hysterical attitude to the BNP was one answer. It's a diversion. Well, where the BNP are organising, it is not a diversion to have to deal with them physically, and I made the point before in my speech, rather than having let the BNP organise in Oldham and so on, and Burnley and so on, rather than let them have started to whip up racism, rather than to have let them started to organise among a white number of white youth to attack the local population, it would have been far better if we'd had a united front of the left, the trade unions, the immigrant populations, the black populations, to stop them giving out their leaflets. That's what I mean, physically stop them giving out their leaflets, physically stop them going around the estates, right? Physically challenging them wherever they try to organise and spread their rubbish, their filth. And that's what it would have been about. That doesn't mean we have to do it nationally every particular moment at all times. Nobody's claiming that. That's a question of struggle. We've had the point made about it's all nonsense unless it's the party. Well, actually, I went further than the party. I raised the stakes already because I said we won't defeat the fascists until we have social revolution. Never mind just the party. The party will be one step, absolutely. We have to raise all these questions. But the building of a party will not come about just because we go and say we need a revolutionary party as an alternative to all the reactionary ideas of the Daily Mail or the fascist politics of the BNP. The building of the party will actually occur and will actually make some real grassroots in the working class when we have answers and solutions not only to the final political aims that we're aiming for, but the daily struggles of the working class. So the struggle against the BNP, just as the struggle against the imperialist war plans in Iraq, just as the struggle against the anti-union laws, are all part and parcel of us presenting our political programme and fighting in that struggle over these specific struggles of the working class. I don't disagree at one level. The BNP have killed far less people than the Labour Party in recent years. The Labour Party leadership has been responsible for governing the capitalist state of the imperialist state of Britain and has gone and bombed and killed hundreds of thousands in Iraq. I'm not good at playing a game of numbers. It's this question of knowing what each thing is and how to deal with it in a specific situation. And as I've said, where they are organising their mass move, they're attempting to organise their movement and attempting to organise intimidation and violence, and effectively what I would like pogroms in various situations, we need to stop them physically. Because somebody said, it's all a question of bad ideas have got to be defeated by superior ideas. Well, at one level that's true. But the class struggle isn't just about competition of ideas. It's a battle. Ultimately, it's about force. And in that sense, it does come down to a question of physical force in some situations, and I am in favour of denying the free speech rights of the fascists in a whole series of situations, expelling them from the unions and so on. I would, absolutely agree with the idea that we expelled organised fascists from the trade union movement. We shouldn't allow them to organise at all. I do want to make one final point. I do think there is a discussion to be had further on the question of fascism and bourgeois parties and so on. I might raise the point about the Conservative Party in the 30s actually being involved in attacks on workers' organisations and so on. And I think we can be clear that there were elements of the British bourgeoisie then that wanted to use auxiliary organisations, in that sense kind of non-state organisations to attack the working class and so on and so forth. They used, certainly for distribution purposes, they used auxiliary organisations to try and undermine and defeat the 26th General Strike. And so there isn't an absolute firmly fixed position in terms of the bourgeoisie. and their politicians. At the moment, I firmly believe that the British bourgeoisie doesn't require the fascists to take power. It is really, and some of the reasons that were said before, it is really an act of last resort for the capitalist class to resort to fascism. It has its own inherent dangers for them. It involves building a mass movement. It leads to instability. They don't need it at the moment. There are other restrictions: the lack of political organisation and consciousness of the working class, the control of the labour bureaucracy, the questions of social democracy. These are all things that mean I don't think the bourgeoisie as a class really wants the fascists at the moment. But they, however much they might believe that now, the bourgeoisie will go for fascist movements when and as required, and they will support them. And I think this is clear. I've got a last quote from Mr. Churchill himself, the great anti-fascist leader, speaking in Rome in 1927. You see, Churchill didn't play it about with fascism, and I'm sure if there was the need for it at a particular time in Britain in the 20s and 30s, Churchill would have been an outright fascist. There's been no doubt about it at all. He himself absolutely thought Signor Mussolini was a fantastic leader, and he was deeply impressed by Mussolini. I'll just say the last point from Churchill. The great fear which has always beset externally your movement has rendered service to the whole world. The great fear which has always beset every democratic leader or working class leader has been that of being undermined by someone more extreme than he. Italy has shown there is a way of fighting the subversive forces which can rally the masses of the people, properly led, to value and wish to defend the honour and stability of civilised society. She has provided the necessary antidote to the Russian poison. Hereafter, no great nation will be unprovided with an ultimate means of protection against the cancerous growth of Bolshevism. That's Churchill. So he knew absolutely that if it was necessary, he would be a fascist. So there isn't a brick wall between one section of the bourgeoisie not being fascist and then they will be. They'll never ever be fascist and so on. But it is a last resort. However, it's a last resort for them taking power. That doesn't mean, just because they won't take power, that there isn't going to be fascist parties built and that the fascists will attempt to build movements. And I believe that's what the BNP is attempting to do now.
No platform, Churchill.
David.
Okay. On the question of differences between bourgeois parties and fascist parties, I think Dave and Jerry are both right to flag up that there are important differences, and that we mustn't fall into the thing of social fascists and all this sort of thing. But when Stuart was pointing out the differences, I think he was pointing out, as Anne and John and other comrades correctly attacked him over, he was actually pointing out similarities between the actions of the fascists and the bourgeois state. They will both, in circumstances, go out and slit your throat and put you in concentration camps. And I think to say that that is the reason why you deny the fascists and no one else democratic rights simply doesn't hold up. On the question of defining fascism, we didn't really get a response from the party majority on this issue of the over-reliance of their definition on fighting formations. Perhaps Ben will come on to that. I think just one thing on that is that as communists, part of our strategy is to have our own fighting formations. We want workers' militias, but do we have them at all times? And we don't at the moment. Does that mean we're not communists? Does that mean we're not members of communist groups and communist organisations? I think that kind of logic is unhelpful, to say the least. Come on to Robbie. He asked a direct question, which is always useful, about exactly how we fight the fascists on our campuses, and he gave the example of Manchester University, of where they had a BNP member standing in the student union election. I think in that situation, as was the case, as Robbie described, it initiated some attacks on campus, or a rise of divisions of that kind. I think it'd be absolutely right to, if you can win the mass support, and you do so on a principled basis, to attempt to no-platform them. By all means, arguing for this in union meetings, but I do draw a distinction here between arguing for this and implementing this as ourselves, basically, on the ground, with the united front of who we can win on a principled basis, and getting a student union to adopt a policy on this. I think Mike is right here in where he outlines the dangers of this kind of thing. We've seen it not just with Oxford, but also on a national basis. NUS has used no-platform policies. The bureaucracy has used no-platform policies, not just to sideline the BNP and the fascist organisations. They've used it to attack radical Islamist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, and they've used it to attack anti-Zionists. This year's NUS conference, we had GUPS, the General Union, hosting in students that their school being removed by the police because of the content of leaflets that they had there. I didn't get to see the leaflet myself. I don't doubt that there was something dodgy in it, but bureaucratically excluding that by bringing in the police is not something I support our student unions doing. And also alongside that, the left needs to take self-defence more seriously. Whether you do or don't win people to no-platform BNP candidates in this way, in a situation like that, you need to think about how you're going to protect oppressed minorities and members of the left groups who are going out and campaigning against the BNP in these situations. Okay, and finally, on to John, because he says that so much of this debate has been a diversion and looking at the wrong things, and that the answer is party. Again, on a formal sense, in a formal sense, John is correct, but you're not linking it in a concrete way with this specific debate on fascism and how we challenge fascism. It's okay, fine to say that when we have a party, we'll be better equipped to fight fascism, and when we've got a revolution, then we can consign it to the dustbin of history and all this. But it does not address the question of how we respond to the BNP in the here and now, in the process of building a party. When we're in the areas that John agrees with Nick, we need to go out to Barking and Dagenham and places like this and build a party and unite the working class. But part of that is going to be campaigning against the BNP. Part of that is going to be fighting them, because they are opponents in those constituencies. And the people who come up to us may be interested in forming some sort of party fighting for socialism. They're going to want to know, what are you going to do about the BNP? How are you going to combat them? And you can't just say, oh, we need a party. You need to say what the party's going to do and what you're going to do in the here and now in building that party.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, and I think I'll predominantly focus on the party question. But quickly on Robbie as well, forgive me if I'm wrong here, but there was also a situation where I think it was Rebecca from Workers' Power was on a platform with the guy, yeah? So I don't know the situation itself. I mean, I agree with Dave on that level in terms of mobilisation. If you can get the forces around you, do it independently of the trade union bureaucracy, etc., etc., etc. But there was the question, I think, concretely posed where this BNP youth organiser was on the hustings platform. And I think she actually went on to the platform and well, apparently she didn't do very little debating him, but I think it just underlined the fact that you have to be fairly flexible in these things. I think there's nothing wrong in principle with her doing that and going along and destroying his ideas along the rest of it. But again, it's something concrete. I don't think we need to get too bogged down in this sense. I disagree with Dave. The point about the party is that the left needs to start, and this is why I think it is. It's not the question that the BNP threat isn't real, all right. But what I'm saying is it's being twisted and distorted to actually reinforce sect projects, particularly in the case of the SWP. Just lost my hearing money. Particularly in the case of the SWP and the Popular Frontist project of UAF, which I think we're all agreed on that. But also in terms of our project and how we look to build a revolutionary organisation. Of course, you have to go to people on the streets with answers. And yes, we defend the United Front. I think the general thesis of Trotsky in terms of the United Front is precisely what we think is actually correct. And organising working class self-defence, organising workers against the BNP, winning the battle of ideas as well, etc., etc. That's part of it. But the key point, and this is where I really have to take issue, in essence, with Permanent Revolution. It's a shame I'm coming on the last speaker, but we had James and I were debating with Stuart on the Communist Students website, and we said, well, how about Permanent Revolution? You're interested in United Marxists as Marxists, right? Let's take serious steps forward, slowly but surely, in terms of working out unity in the student movement on that principle basis of Marxism. And Stuart said, well, look at your position on fascism, look at your position on Israel-Palestine. And James and I just started laughing because James and I do not agree on, James is in the minority of the CPGB on the question of fascism, and I think you still are, and we also disagree, So the question is posed, how do we overcome where we are now? And I think just calling for a united front, although that's actually correct in terms of its approach, the left sects will say, well, what we need is a united front against fascism. Well, of course, but it doesn't answer the deeper questions of where we are and what we need, and it's precisely the political alternative. And I'll come back to the question of poison and a pistol in that sense. The BNP's ideas are poison in the working class movement that are slowly seeping into it and must be combated. We have to be clear on that. We can't be complacent, we can't be aloof to that. All right? But the pistol, in that sense, what we need to organise against directly and is the other parties, and precisely the method of no platform is conducive, and the way it's being conducted is conducive to tailing. We need to actually organise, not just on the basis of a united front, but we need to, as the left and the Permanent Revolution, make certain moves in that direction, which is good, of actually taking up our ideas, debating that and going forward slowly in terms of what we need is a party. That's not absolutist, that's not saying, well, fuck it, the BNP are always going to be around until we have workers' power, and that's not to say the point. It's just saying that we need to think in terms of that strategy and what we actually need. And that is a minimum programme for the Republic. And I know that causes certain problems with people like Jerry, because they say, well, in the 1870s or whatever, imperialism came about and something changed. Well, of course it changed. But we were making the point to you, we were watching the film on Rosa Luxemburg. I think Jerry was there, he may have had a heart attack. Rosa Luxemburg, in the run-up to the First World War, is pacing up and down, desperately, saying, fuck, it's coming to war. And she said, well, what do you... I think she's talking to Karl Zetkin, isn't she? So what do you want, Rosa? She said, we want the Republic. Right? And you can say, well, they had a Kaiser, so but that's just silly, come on. Right? It's these ideas that the left needs to organise around to pose a genuine alternative, not just going out in the United Front and leafleting for better, as you said, Dave, quite rightly, for our positions on housing, on immigration, etc. Not just for that, but we have to overcome this impasse that we're currently finding ourselves in if we are to go forward and build the party that we need.